Hi, my name is Hannah, and today we will interview David Francis. A national of both the UK and the US, David has 4 decades of experience in finance in New York, London, and Singapore. He is a financial advisor that we interviewed in March this year. We decided to have a follow-up interview to get his views on how things have evolved since we last spoke.
This podcast channel is about you, successful international entrepreneurs, successful expats, successful investors. Sponsored by HCJ.tax. Live. Good evening, David. How are you this evening?
I'm very well, thank you. Good to see you, man.
Thanks for coming back. So for those who may be watching or listening for the first time, David was one of our more popular interviews when we first started a few months ago. So, I just had to listen to the people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. So you wanted him back. Here he is. So David, could you introduce yourself to those who may be hearing you for the first time?
David, I've been in Asia now since, in fact, next month, I'll be here for 13 years. Yeah. Came over to have a look-see, and 13 years later, and And I work in the financial sector for a local outfit, about 250 consultants, and I'm one of the managers there, working together with an expat team. So most of our clientele tend to be expatriates, and more and more, because of the way things are changing, dealing in the local market, like high net worth individual Singaporeans and other Southeast Asians.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, David has been pretty modest. David has been doing finance for longer than most of us have been alive. He started off in the UK, worked in the US, and went back and forth, and then ended up in Singapore 13 years ago. He has a wealth, a breadth and depth of understanding of financial markets and financial products. So thank you for sharing your time.
Thank you. Also known as being very, very old.
So as we were saying, like when we first had this conversation, what was it, like 4 or 5 months ago, we imagined what this present pandemic would be like, and therefore, what would be the best way to position ourselves as entrepreneurs, as business people, as international professionals. A lot has happened since then, and some things we may have got right, and some things perhaps we underestimated or overestimated. So with the benefit of hindsight, 2020 hindsight, what are your thoughts on the last few months versus what you expected it to be?
Well, I think like everybody else, it appears this pandemic is going to be going on for a lot longer than we thought. I've got a doctor friend here. She actually worked on the front line with the foreign migrant workers, so she has a very interesting perception of the pandemic and how it really affected people on the lower rung of society. And she feels we're not going to get anywhere near what we were like last year until 2024. This is despite having a successful vaccine. And you could devote a whole program just to the whole vaccine debate, right? And how have things panned out? I think personally, I've been okay because I'm fairly rooted here now because I've been here for so long. But as you probably know more than most, I don't read into, I think you gave me some astronomical figure of expatriates with employment passes who had left Singapore. A figure came out recently, about 190,000, with more to come, which is not great, but it's very, very unsettling for a lot of the expats that have remained.
Mm-hmm.
That said, because of all the situation that's going on between the US and China, and the protests over the last few years in Hong Kong, we're seeing a big uptick in family offices, and also a growth of small asset managers and fund houses.
Mm.
And we touched on in our last conversation, obviously, the whole tech space, because Singapore is trying to position itself as a Silicon Valley of the Southeast Asia.
Mm.
So yeah, and in terms, we want to get a little bit technical. I think in April we saw, whereas in 2015 there were like foreign currency deposits of about 7 to 9 billion Sing dollars. By April of this year, that had gone up to like almost 27 billion. So yeah, and huge siphoning of money coming this way.
Mm.
And I find the whole thing very interesting in how different pockets of the globe have dealt with the pandemic and how that's affected people. In Singapore, we're still very much, if you were to go downtown or into the central business district, everyone's wearing a mask.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you go out in the evening, as long as it's before 10 p.m., you think that there's nothing, everybody's out there eating and drinking and very, very, it's almost like nothing's changed. But the government is very, very mindful of the second wave. Everyone's talking about the second wave.
Mm.
And I think that we're seeing now a lot of commentators falling into two camps. You have, and I'll be interested to find out which camp you fall into, especially over the last few months. I'm pretty certain I could put you in back in March when we had the conversation, but I'm not sure now. So there are two camps: the optimists and the pessimists.
Mm-hmm.
So the optimists, they feel that the three crises are inequality, climate change, and crisis of democracy, which is, and basically that crisis of democracy has failed to tackle those other two crises.
Mm.
And they have a view that post-pandemic, hopefully there'll be a global response and we'll have a better world. Then you have the pessimists who feel that we're descending into 1930s fascism. The days of globalism are dead forever, and the free market is just profit making and not really confronting, the human tragedy that we're seeing. I think today I heard in the US, about 200,000 deaths from COVID, and some institute is predicting if there's not a concerted change in their mandate, that's going to double by the end of January. If you look here, there've been some interesting successes. I think in Thailand, they've had like one transmission in the last 120 days. So they're effectively COVID-free. Vietnam, they've had about 34 deaths. Singapore, we've had a lot of cases, but still very, very few deaths. And I think the feeling is, it's like anywhere else. If you have a job and that's kind of filtered out already, that the jobs that can afford to let people stay at home, they tend to be fine. But the people that are got to go out there, the front line and key workers, who are most at risk, getting paid F4, they're still the ones that are very, very vulnerable. And now that the borders are still closed or semi-closed, that mobility as well, we're not sure how that's going to pan out. So long story short, a lot of uncertainty. A lot of uncertainty. Then we have the ambiguity of the stock market. I think back in, memory serves me well, back in April, you had the stock market had its best month since 1987, but yet you had 42 million people in the US, losing their jobs. So and back to Singapore, there seems to be, from people in the know, that a lot of the employment passes, or the restriction of them, are geared towards Indians, because they're, again, going back to what I mentioned about trying to cultivate or develop Singapore into this tech hub. A lot of those tech jobs are held by Indians, and in a situation that we're in now, it's only natural that they're going to want to put their citizens first. So,
Okay, so you gave us a lot to think about there. I just made some notes, and if I'm going to start from the beginning, the point that you raised about the family offices and the inflow of capital, and I guess just stepping back before I dive into that, I think you kind of hinted that your interpretation, an individual's interpretation of what's happening, is driven by who and where they are, because no two people's experiences would be exactly the same. So there are some industries that are doing well, some industries that are struggling, some economies are doing well, some are struggling. And even within an economy that's doing well, some social classes are doing well, some are not. So there are a lot of dimensions to this, to what's happening. In terms of the family office thing, I mean, again, even before the pandemic, we knew that Asia as a whole was facing a crisis of succession. It's not like the US, or not like the Europe specifically, which has a legacy when it comes to businesses. There are businesses here that are hundreds of years old. In Europe, Asia, all business is new business. Aside from Japan, all business is new business. China's just come out of the Cultural Revolution and embraced free market economies. Singapore is just 1 or 2 generations in from being a so-called fishing village to being the hub that it is. So everyone is a new business, and this is the first time that you're having this massive transfer of wealth from one generation to another. And with there being no precedent, again, outside of Japan, people are still trying to figure it out, which means that I imagine that solutions like family offices and small advisory teams are coming into their own at this particular point in time. And one of the effects of having the news cycle constantly brainwash you with thoughts of morbidity is the fact that you think about mortality. And even if, you're relatively young, 40s, 50s or whatever, you start to think, well, just in case, let me get my affairs in order. So let's get proper governance. Let's get proper, financial advisors in. Let's get, trust estate plans done. Let's get things in a proper way so that I won't be a burden to those who come after me. So I guess that makes sense. And in that way, Singapore disproportionately benefits because of the uncertainty around Hong Kong right now. Speaking to people in Hong Kong, I get the point that sometimes the media does kind of exaggerate things, as they do in the US with the protests. Sometimes yes, there are things going on, but sometimes they play it up in one way or the other because they run a business like everyone else. They need to sell their products. So we get that. Hong Kong is not going to go away. China will need a gateway. You know, a common law jurisdiction where you can get certain things done that you can't get done on the mainland. It's necessary. It's necessary. You know, I imagine it kind of like how the UK has the Channel Islands, or Malaysia has Labuan. Everybody needs that one jurisdiction sometimes to get things done. So that'll be Hong Kong. In terms of the expat exodus, and again, this one of those pre-existing patterns that we were seeing. Even from Shanghai down to Hong Kong, all the way down to Singapore and Indonesia, Jakarta, we saw that there were fewer expats. And expats, of course, it's a contentious term depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
That's Western workers. So Western migrant workers, you know, they were already on the decline relative to other classes of workers, but specifically those from within Asia. So that was already happening. Of course, it's accelerated now. You know, like myself, you know, why am I? One asks ourselves the question, and many of my clients have been doing the same. Why am I in Singapore or Asia when I can't meet? So my real thing for coming to Singapore was to be part of that ecosystem. It's kind of like going to San Francisco. I want to be part of Silicon Valley. I want to rub shoulders with these thinkers and be on the cutting edge of what's happening.
You want to be where the action is.
Exactly, and get synergy, get ideas, get deals, right? Now I can't meet people. We don't have seminars like before. We don't have the networking events like before. So like, what's the point of being there if everything is online or webinar? I don't need to be there.
And
so I don't
need, and it's not the cheapest jurisdiction either.
Yeah, and it's not just Singapore. We're seeing it, of course, with the shortage of U-Haul vans to get stuff out of New York, Chicago, the exodus from LA, these big names like Joe Rogan, Elon Musk leaving California and taking their businesses with them. I hear people talk about London as well. Don't know how real that is, but the whole idea of needing to be in the central business district, at least while this is happening, it's less appealing. It's less appealing. And that makes sense. But for city-state, that has implications because there is no countryside. There's no Surrey to go through from London. There's no, you know, Hamptons to go through from New York. You know, it's Singapore. Either in Singapore, you're out of Singapore. So that has implications for them, and they're planning accordingly. I am also hearing anecdotal. Well, we've had, you know, personal situations like our maid wanted to move from our family to another family. And then, you know, just in the expat groups, it was denied 3 times. And then we're hearing in the expat groups on Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever that, everybody's having that problem because they anticipate, well, there'll be fewer there'll be fewer families that can afford it. So therefore we need fewer maids. So denied. Unless again, in terms of employment passes, unless you come from, you know, unless you're Dyson or, you know, somebody's coming, something recognizable, you kind of get played to the back. I take your point about the pandemic as well being long-term. And I think all those who expect a return to 2019 next year, the following year, they're completely delusional. We've had flu vaccines for 76 years. And the thing is, it mutates every year. So this is a variant of the flu, apparently. So it's not going to solve everything. It's not going to be the panacea. So this is,
and also the distribution of any vaccine as well. You don't know how long that will take.
Exactly. So this, you know, I don't even know if we can say new normal because normal suggests stability. And we're facing the opposite. There is no stability. There is no certainty, which is fine. You just adapt to that. So this is post-normal rather than new normal. That's how I look at it. Unfortunately, one of the side effects is nationalism and its ugly friend, xenophobia, which obviously it's been in the media, not just in Singapore, but everywhere, because when there's an economic contraction, that's what people do. They look at...
And also in this virus, scapegoating, you know, blaming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think given, again, you touch on the trade war, the globalization won't come to a halt, obviously, because remember, globalization has been with us since Christopher Columbus decided to move stuff back and forth. So globalization is nothing new, but perhaps the there'll be a big supply chain story, which is still happening, which it creates, additional costs and uncertainty and complexity around supply chains. But what is benefiting, I believe, is the hyperglobalization of services. So if you're a service provider, you can get on Zoom and you can sell your wares across the world uninhibited as a result of, the other side of digitalization. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on.
I've got a good figure for you.
Yeah.
Apparently, last month, the head of sales for Zoom in Singapore made over $300,000.
That's a decent month's work, right? Wow. So yeah, I mean, again, there are winners and unfortunately a lot of losers. And the job description of someone who can afford to work remotely, who would benefit from what's happening now, they're probably on the higher end of the socioeconomic ladder. If I'm a cleaner, if I have like a regular job, chances are work from home isn't an option for me, and I'm going to struggle. So there'll be winners and there'll be losers. Now, having framed all that, where do we go from here? What are your thoughts?
Well, I read a book recently by a guy called Daniel Susskind, and it's dubbed "A World Without Work." And this is a view that's been around for, particularly after the Industrial Revolution, say like robots or the AI then is going to, take away our jobs. But now there's a lot of stuff coming out saying, well, actually, that's already here already. And what we're seeing now, what we're going through now is perhaps a glimpse into the future. And if you look at what, obviously, because of the job I do, I hear all sorts of stories about who got laid off, from what company, from what sector, or I'm sitting in front of a client, we're having a chat, and they're not sure whether their job is going to be around this time next year, or they've heard there are going to be some cuts, but they're not sure which areas. So a lot of stuff going around, surrounding employment. And if you look at in America, I think in the hospitality and leisure, I think half the jobs went, then they took some people back. But now what we're hearing is the ones that have come back, I think 1 in 4 have gone back, but the rest, that's it. To use your term, that low-hanging fruit, that's gone. So and some of these people they're not in their 20s or their 30s. Reskilling is, it's going to be very, very tricky. So what this book touches on is, in a world where we have less jobs, but still a lot of people, how do you, and he uses this word, how do you achieve gainful unemployment? And then the whole area and question around incentives, because we still need that people to contribute into the collective pie. But how wounded do you feel if you're doing all this work, be it from home or wherever, you're paying your taxes, and then somebody else who's on a universal basic wage is probably doing a lot better than you in terms of work-life balance. And I find that whole aspect of things very interesting. In Singapore, you don't really hear the real unemployment rate. But again, anecdotally, people are finding things very, very difficult. And the fact that they're not renewing employment passes in certain jobs and industries, even though the reason why a lot of, go back to the Indian story, they're willing to, you know, take a job which a local probably wouldn't want to do for 10,000 a month. They'll do it for half that amount.
Mm-hmm.
So as a business owner, you know, what do you do? So now the latest figure I've heard of this quarter, or last quarter, sorry, 400 million jobs around the world have gone. In the US, 400,000 businesses have gone. Again, in Singapore, it's very difficult to get your hands on those figures.
Mm-hmm.
But as you know, you've been here. They'll do whatever they need to do to keep people at work. Another study I read is this guy. He works for Morgan Stanley, an
Mm-hmm.
Indian chap called Ruchir Sharma, and he has a very interesting analysis. And he's picked 6 countries who he feel will be winners after the pandemic, and you'll be really surprised. And the criteria he uses are there's four criteria. Strong domestic economy, strong domestic market, competent government based strictly on how they dealt with the virus, and he has a very simple matrix: cases and deaths per million.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the third criteria is taking on you know, digitalization and the investment into R&D.
Mm-hmm.
And the last criteria would be a country's deficit or debt. And all the ones that you thought would be in there, not there. China's not there. Singapore's not there.
Wow.
Obviously the US. And I think number 1 is Germany.
Right.
Because they went into the crisis with a very, very low level of debt. I think they were under lockdown for about a month.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Angela Merkel wants to leave a legacy. So I think they just set up the European, you're probably more familiar than I am, the European Recovery Fund. So that'll hopefully help the North-South divide. Another country that's in there is Finland, Vietnam, Switzerland, Taiwan, and the dark horse, Russia. Yeah. Very, very interesting. And the Russian story is because of when they invaded Ukraine in 2014, Putin realized how vulnerable they were, so they started to you know, really build up or pay off their foreign debts and really strengthen the ruble. So they become very, very insulated from what's going on in the world. And but for Singapore, as you know, we're living you do live in a bit of a bubble here. But if you're in the right place, I've got a friend, he works in the tech sector, he's a recruiter, so I get a lot of intel from him, and he feels that he gives Singapore 10 years to make some. I mean, the US is always going to be, you know, ahead of the curve, but he can see that there'll be a real player when it comes to innovations in tech, etc., just based on the kind of talent that they can attract.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, you know, kudos to Singapore. It faces each challenge and constantly reinvents itself. Kind of like Madonna, you know, like Madonna always relevant, and you forget how old she is.
But not as narcissistic.
Yeah. So definitely, you know, hands down, Singapore will figure it out. It always has. It always has.
Yeah.
It'll figure it out. But then the question becomes, though, well, yes, it'll figure it out from an economic point of view, but in terms of quality of life, would it offer what, you know, at least the Western expat has grown to enjoy, that diversity, that, like theater, entertainment, that all the amenities that make for the experience. Because for many Westerners, we traded what would have been bigger accommodation to come and live in a small space, relatively small condo, relatively, because we knew there are lots of things to do outside and
Yeah.
whatever. And with
Or you can travel around the region. Yeah.
travel around the region, enjoy Asia, People say the best thing about Singapore is the airport. So, but if you can't use the airport and under certain conditions you can't use your gym or your swimming pool or whatever, then what about quality of life issues? And I think that's interesting that most of the countries you listed are in Europe. So
Yeah.
interestingly enough, today when I updated my social media, so every day I just put up like some quote. I put up a quote from one of the professionals who works in the economic migration space. And they've all been saying, I interviewed probably 2 or 3 of them recently, and they're all saying, hey, Europe. Europe is where it's at. So I think, yeah.
Which is odd, because before the pandemic,
yeah,
Europe was the sick man of the world, right?
exactly.
So,
yeah. So amazing how things turn around, right?
Yeah. If you, I suppose, if you take the UK out of it.
Yeah. But even the UK, again, it depends on where you find yourself.
Yeah.
I think UK is going to really be a winner in terms of financial services when they are unencumbered by the rules from the continent, and they can do crazy offshore things to their heart's content without being.
This is despite this messy divorce.
Despite the messy divorce, because I'm thinking of, like, let's say 5-7 years ago, when remember we had it was the height of the res non dom regime in London, and they were counting something like 83 billionaires in London because they were all able to live there. High net worth individuals were able to live there almost tax free. You just pay that flat amount every year and you're good. And then Europe complained. I think they started complaining after the wealthiest guy from Sweden moved down there. And so the other Northern European countries complained, and Brussels made them change the rules, and we had this deemed domicile thing kick in. So my point is that everyone looks at Switzerland, but the real play in offshore really is the UK and its dependencies. I mean, the BVIs, the Caymans, the Bermudas. Once you throw them all into the mix, it's really the UK, Channel Islands, and the city of London itself. I think it's always been low tax, light touch. And once you no longer have to pay any mind to what Brussels thinks or says, they're going to have a good time. But of course, that's the square mile. That is not the regular Londoner, the regular guy in Glasgow, Birmingham, or Manchester, or whatever. They will struggle. But the guys who are in that ecosystem, that's why they were fanning the flames of Nigel Farage, because I imagine they were putting money into his campaign because they saw an ROI. So that's me imagining what's going on in the UK.
Singapore and Thames.
Pretty much, yes. Because you're right. In the discussion, the narrative has been around, hey, we can become a Singapore. So you're right. Yeah, you're right. But yeah, Europe and the Caribbean as well, because I know that, I mean, some islands different from the others, but for example, Barbados has always been quite progressive. And so they realized a while ago that
the Republic of Barbados,
soon to be the Republic of Barbados, very progressive now. They saw a while ago that, hey, this return to 2019, that is delusional. Short-term tourism is over for the foreseeable future. And they, together with, I think, Bermuda, they were like the first out of the block with these long stay visas. And I understand within the first month, they had over 1,000 applications.
Really?
Yeah. And so hotels like the Hilton, they're repurposing themselves for a long stay visitor rather than a 2-week visitor, Same in Asia. I think Indonesia is being delusional. They should have listened to Bali. I think Manila's being delusional. They should listen to Palawan and these other enclaves, as Bangkok has listened to, I think it was Koh Samui or Phuket. I think it's Phuket. And so they're saying, okay, right, we're locked down, but if you want to come to Thailand, it has to be at least for a few months, and you have to quarantine in one of the expensive hotels in Phuket. And after you do 3 weeks quarantine, then you'll be allowed to travel around Thailand.
Yeah.
So because it's about recognizing short term is over, it has to be long term.
Yeah, but I think also they've been quite smart because for many years now they've also been building their industrial base. So they can, again, they're a bit more insulated, I think.
So it, to me, just plays into the point you made earlier, that there's certain countries that for whatever reason they're able to think and plan and execute longer term, whereas some other countries obviously they struggle.
But we haven't mentioned the continent of Africa.
I'll let you go there first.
Well, you got all these big second, or is it 2.5 wave in places like the UK, the US, but in Africa, I think last week they were doing some number crunching, and their cases are down by 14%. And they've been asking people like European leaders or governors calling up the Africans to ask them what are they doing right. And the guy on the radio was saying that as we both know, always with Africa, there's a lot of people saying that the figures are bogus, and there's a lot more. But he said that's not true at all. They're doing lots and lots of testing, but partly because the continent has a very young population, they're probably not as vulnerable as say in Italy or Japan. But they've actually they like many of the countries that we've spoken about, like some of the islands in the Caribbean, they made a coordinated effort, continental effort, quite early on. And if you go down the streets of Addis Ababa, people although the cases are down, everyone's still wearing a mask. So I think there's a lot to learn on the continent.
I think it may be a case kind of like it was saying in the Caribbean or even in Europe or Asia, where some did well and some may be struggling. So I guess like the ones that you expect, like a Rwanda, you would have expected them to be like the trendsetter. And then there are those that, let's say on the other side, like a Zimbabwe, where the whole all the healthcare and the whole health system may be a bit behind, that they would struggle, and in terms of testing as well, therefore the actual numbers may be less accurate than otherwise. But I think, okay, Africa, yes, young population, and Africa is a huge continent. When I look at some of the maps, the real maps, not the ones that the sides of Africa, like all of Western Europe fits in the Congo and all sorts of stuff. So it's huge. So it's not as densely populated as as the European peninsula, because we say it's a continent, but in fact it's just a peninsula of Eurasia, or like in New York or whatever the case may be. It's spread out. So we would expect them to recover faster, but then it's okay. And then what happens? Because I noticed from looking at just videos and trying to keep up with the news, like parts of Nigeria and stuff, that there has been a bit of a backlash against Chinese investments in certain African countries. And, in my mind, like some of the larger African countries, I put them in the same space as like an Indonesia or Brazil, in the sense that it just disappoints. There's so much potential
Yeah.
But will they continue to just not realize that potential?
Yeah, but you say that, but look at, if you go back to tech,
yeah.
because a lot of them,
Mhm.
a lot of people don't have a bank account,
Yeah.
and the infrastructure is wanting. So there's an explosion in e-health and fintech, and no, I'm actually quite, for the first time in a long time, fairly optimistic for Africa. Again, yeah, you're right. We have to distinguish. It's a huge continent, and Central Africa is very different to your Ghanas and your Nigerias and your Ethiopian Rwandas. But I think they're proven to be probably the most innovative at this time.
Mm. You're right. It does create like an opportunity, because moving around Europe, for example, one of the first things that hit me, like the capitals are just so old.
Yeah.
Central business district, the trains are just like really old.
Yeah.
Because in the back of my mind,
You've been living in Asia too long.
I've been living in Asia too long, where everything is brand spanking new. You jump on the MRT, it's like, wow. Whereas here, they're still kind of catching up. So that's one of the advantages, right? They can leapfrog into whatever the latest thing is. So it does create an opportunity. And, I've been also monitoring some YouTubers, YouTube channels of people from the UK as well as from the US who have made that move to Africa. I think one country may be offering citizenship soon.
That's right. Yeah.
So for those who can seize the opportunity, absolutely, there's a lot going on. Yeah. All right. So going forward, if I'm summarizing, so Asia is still, such a huge chunk of the world's population. So there's a lot going on in terms of innovation, natural resources. There'll always be a lot going on. But to some extent, for the Western type of expat, they may have seen their day. It's not the up and coming place that it once was. So there still is opportunity, but not in the way it once was.
But that may change.
But of course, that may change. Like it changed for like how Europe turned on a dime, right?
Yeah.
Last year it was Europe, but now Europe.
Yeah.
Proper healthcare, you can social distance because you have large spaces.
Yeah.
Green outdoors, whatever. So yeah, it could turn. It could turn. Africa, an opportunity to keep an eye on.
Definitely.
Especially as it
But
comes.
yeah, I'm with you on I was speaking to a friend who's lives in Sydney, and she's talking about going to live in Barbados herself next year.
Yeah.
So she was in Australia about 15 years ago. Then she came to Singapore. She was there for about a decade. Then she went back to Australia, and now originally from London, and now she's going to end up in Barbados.
Yeah. I mean, even the way Australia and New Zealand have handled this. Now, if it is that you are wealthy enough, so you're not really in the CBD in Melbourne or whatever, you're out in the suburbs anyway, you have a large house, you have a lot of land around you, whatever, maybe you're fine. But the way that they are approaching it right now, from what we see in the media, which can be distorted, I know, it just seems to be rubbing people the wrong way. So it may make it less attractive. I've met Aussies here in Lisbon, and they're like, even if we could go back, we don't want to go back.
Yeah.
So,
But before we were off camera, and you mentioned about Sweden. So they've done something alternative there, because you're saying they didn't have a lockdown. Is that correct?
Yeah. So now this is one where there's a lot of debate. There's a lot of debate, right? Because it's basically a different philosophy, and which I can understand. But essentially, just to summarize it, Sweden and Switzerland, they never went into the full lockdown mode where you cannot go out, or you can only go to the supermarket, you must work from home. For the most part, schools remained open for most of the time. There were some areas and sometimes when it may have closed, but for the most part, generally speaking, schools remained open and people were circulating. Yes, there were some masks, there was some social distancing. It's not that they ignored it, but their approach was, we're not going to destroy the economy.
Right.
Same with Switzerland. And well, you know, Switzerland always does its own thing anyway, so that's no surprise.
Yeah.
And the outcome, again, the numbers are hotly debated, is that from an economic standpoint, there was a downturn because it's an export-driven economy. And the people who buy their stuff went into recession. So therefore, they would dip, but not as much as other countries that did lockdown, which is kind of logical. In terms of actual deaths, well, there's some that say yes, it did go up a bit. But again, like everyone was saying, it's older people with comorbidities and so on. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But the point is, other countries in Europe took note and it started a debate. Obviously, Spain didn't agree with them, but other countries, including like Germany, Denmark, I understand they've said, well, you know, maybe we should take a page out of their playbook. So, and here in Portugal, the sentiment that I get is definitely not again. And we're seeing people coming over. I met people that have moved here from Spain. I think the King of Spain wants to come here, which is a whole other political thing. But anyway, so it's becoming more appealing, their way of handling it.
Right.
It's not that they're insensitive. We're not allowed to have more than 10 at a gathering, mask indoors, so on and so forth. But the whole idea of destroying the economy, not again.
But these are comparatively small populations, right? If you compare to an India or Brazil or America.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another point that's made. I remember reading a professor from Stanford University about the statistic. He said that the statistics are basically useless because every country defines it differently.
Yeah.
Every country defines, so for example, according to strict interpretation of CDC rules in the US, there was a case, and I'm not kidding, someone was riding a bike and they were hit by a car, but they died from impact, but they were positive. So what do you put on the death certificate? According to strict interpretation of CDC rules, COVID-19.
COVID-19, yeah.
Right, and you know, the numbers have been massaged downwards. All the models have been massaged. I remember at the beginning of the year when we first spoke, there was the Imperial model, and I think the Oxford model, and they were all saying millions dead. And as each month went by, each team of statisticians, they were bringing those numbers down. So much so that the media stopped reporting deaths and started reporting infections, because then that became more sensationalist, because the actual death rate was much lower than expected. Thank God, that's a good thing. But it's a tough call, right? Because wouldn't you rather prepare for the worst but hope for the best? So maybe the governments did do the right thing by just shutting everything down because they didn't know.
Yeah.
So you prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But now that we know a bit more, the question is, do we revise our approach? And some countries are saying, yes, we will revise our approach. And some countries are saying, no, we will do exactly the same thing. Think of Australia and New Zealand, they're going to do exactly the same thing. So yeah, at least for the foreseeable future, certain countries seem, for those who have the luxury of moving and those who can work remotely for whatever their professional situation, some countries are going to be more appealing than others.
And what about air travel? Because in Singapore, if you try and come into here, you have to go into a hotel that they allocate and you've got to pay $2,000.
Yeah, which is the same in Australia. It's an Asian thing. I noticed that, like, there's a difference between Asia and the East and the West. And again, it has to do with culture. The West inherently doesn't trust its government. Asia inherently does trust its government. And a number of reasons. But yeah, so non-essential travel is really locked down in Asia. But, you know, I'm having a call. I had a call with one of my team members before this one. And yes, you know, we all know people who are moving around. but you must get special permission. And each country has its own unwritten and written rules as to who goes and who comes. But it is possible, you know. I got permission to return to Singapore, but I decided, you know what, I do 2 weeks and then what? I can't really.
But what would have happened when you got here?
As you said, you know, I have to do 2 weeks in quarantine.
Yeah.
I was going to come from Germany. I was going to do time in Germany, which meant at that point in time, like 2 months ago, I can just do the 2 weeks in my condo.
Yeah.
So that was an option. But then I thought, okay, even if I were to do that, then what? Are we going to have seminars still? Are we going to have networking events? Am I to see my clients? You know, the word from Ministry of Manpower is the new default is work from home.
Yeah.
So why am I here? So I decided to plant a flag here in Europe, at least for a bit. But people are moving around Asia compared to the West. In and out of the US, I've been on full flights moving around between Spain, Portugal, UK, US. I was in Texas, obviously Florida. Yeah, people are moving. People are moving. When I first flew into LA in April, the flight was empty coming out of Japan, out to Tokyo. And even domestically within the US, it was like 20% full. But now airlines have reduced capacity as well. So, I mean, they have to make money as well. So the point is there's still relative freedom of movement once you are a citizen or a resident or whatever. The most they would say is, well, you have to quarantine, and that's self-quarantine, not in a hotel.
Yeah.
But there's still freedom of movement, and there's active resistance from elements within each population that don't want those freedoms removed. Whereas in Asia, I think the consensus is they're happy to give up that freedom in return for safety.
Yeah.
Just like a different culture.
Yeah, and also the psyche is different when it comes to civil obedience, I guess.
Yes, yeah, following the rules. And what about the last but not least, the markets? So,
well, you have a president in the White House who is quite obvious. He has three things that he wants to happen.
Yeah.
By the time the election arrives in November, a booming stock market, low interest rate environment, and a competitive dollar.
Yeah.
And that's backed by a central bank that will do anything to, keep those asset prices.
Keep going. Yeah. So you do not bet against the Fed. So the U.S. market, well, not the general U.S. market, but I guess the NASDAQ, like the technology related companies.
Yeah, but I mean, the FANGs, I mean, they represent what, 20% of the S&P 500, and that's what's keeping the tide up.
Right.
But I still feel, I mean, where do you put your money? I mean, bond yields are so low. It doesn't matter where in the world you are. I mean, Japan and Europe, it's negative. So it's got to be stocks, or leave the money in the bank and you're getting, again, not very much. So it's still the stock market. And then it becomes a conversation with my clients. It becomes a time frame conversation, to be honest.
And it's going to be mainly the U.S. market because, like, for example, Warren Buffett seems to like Japan. So is it Japan?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more value in Asia, definitely. Again, we talked about Vietnam in that those winners after the pandemic. They're looking to be the fastest growing economy in 2020. Obviously, Taiwan, South Korea. There's still a lot of value in China. And actually here in Singapore, I heard, here's a stock tip for the viewers, Singtel.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So Asia, a lot of value, but in China, given the tensions, do you think that they'd still be welcoming of Western investors, or?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And if you look at, again, you were talking earlier about what sensationalized in the press. I mean, business is still being conducted in Hong Kong.
That's right. Yeah. So if it's happening in Hong Kong, it's happening everywhere. Yeah. David, thank you again for sharing your insights and for the stock tip at the end there. So anyone who listened all the way to the end, now they're going to be a lot richer as a result of it.
And thank you for having me again.
No problem.
Please subscribe, like, share, and comment below. Our books and upcoming event are available at htj.tax. Email us at help@htj.tax to engage us, to advise on international tax or business matters.